Great. So today's topic is talking about addressing social and ethical dilemmas in citizen science. And we have two great speakers to share with us their expertise. As Julia mentioned, this is the 5th week, but we do have 3 more weeks afterwards. Just to point out, these are our topics that are coming up: the apps, mobile phones, and sensor-based hydrological monitoring, talking about lessons learned from some long-term programs, and thinking about using citizen science data to inform hydrological models are the following weeks. So today's first speaker is Karen Cooper. Karen's an associate professor of public science in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at North Carolina State University. She's the liaison for special collections with the open access peer-reviewed journal, Citizen Science Theory and Practice. And she's the author of 2 books, a 2016 book called Citizen Science: How Ordinary People Are Changing the Face of Discovery, and the co-author of a 2020 book, A Field Guide to Citizen Science: How You Can Contribute to Scientific Research and Make a Difference. She's going to be talking to us today about Crowd the Tap, a project that focuses on safe drinking water in homes, and her talk is titled Engaging Diverse Participants in Screening Drinking Water Quality via a variety of facilitator organizations. So I'll turn that over to Karen. Thanks for being here.
Great, thank you. Here, let me start my slides. All right. Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me as part of this series. And I'm really pleased to be in this section on addressing social and ethical dilemmas in managing citizen science projects. And the dilemma for this talk is about racial diversity in participation. And citizen science has such amazing potential to democratize science, and scholars certainly debate like the extent to which that happens or that it can happen, but it attempts this by engaging the public in ways that influence the process and the products of science so that the science can best serve society. And of course, that means all segments of society. So if there's really some segments of our populations that are marginalized and not sufficiently represented as participants, then that also might mean they're not best served by the projects. And that's an ethical challenge and a social challenge, because then our projects can actually function in ways that perpetuates social inequities. So what I'm presenting today is, for the most part, is in a paper that's in review right now, that's led by a postdoc in my lab, Danny Lynn Hunter. And we just want to thank the funders, which is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Science Foundation, and the North Carolina Water Resources Research Institute. But before I present that, I wanted to just take a quick aside, just since this is the section on ethics, to say that I led this co-creation of a data ethics toolkit for the participatory sciences. And it is released now. It was created by and for those who lead citizen science projects and who want help in thinking like an ethicist. And so the toolkit is available in 2 different complementary formats. You can download it as a PDF with worksheets, or you can also access it as an interactive online tutorial on SciStarter, where you can earn a badge that's like hooked to LinkedIn and stuff like that. But for today's talk, I'm going to focus on Crowd the Tap, which is a public science project focused on drinking water and on drinking water infrastructure in the United States. So Crowd the Tap differs from most of the water monitoring projects in this series because the unit of analysis is the household. So rather than focusing on water bodies, we know that when it comes to lead, the potential for lead contamination, that the source of that is the pipes that transport water. And so that's the focus of this project. So just a little background on, I guess, in the US, the utilities are responsible for like the public shared, publicly owned portions of the infrastructure, which is like in the pink and the red in this picture. And then each private owner is responsible for like the blue portions, that household portion of the pipe infrastructure. And US law is written that eliminating lead in water is a shared responsibility between the utilities and the homeowners. And for the utility side, basically their requirements are that they test a subsample of customer homes each year. And if they find a certain percentage of homes have lead over a certain actionable threshold, then the action they have to take is to notify customers and then treat the water to control corrosion. And beyond that, though, there's little support for households. And Crowd the Tap tries to provide resources and whatnot specifically for households. And we provide water testing, but we can't test every single home. And so Crowd the Tap functions as a screening tool and a citizen science project. So just briefly, members of households can share information about the types of pipes, and it's not just if there's lead pipes, there could be steel pipes that are lined with lead, there can be copper pipes that are soldered with lead, the age of the home, and then just really simple water chemistry tests. And we use that information basically as a screening process to prioritize how we allocate the limited number of testing that we can provide. And if people don't, if they're unknown risk, we ask for more information. If they're high risk, then we offer different types of testing. And I mean, ultimately, the end goal is to make sure that every household is safe. But we can't really have an equal distribution of people ending up safe if there's disparities in who is participating. And as researchers are starting to look at participation in citizen science, like what's really emerging is that we're seeing that participants tend to be highly educated, affluent, and white. And so here's just some examples, because this was seen in this paper by Blake et al. In 2020. This was for volunteer water monitors in the state of Illinois, right, with a program called Riverwatch. And you can see that, like in the state of Illinois, the population is, I don't know, maybe about 60% white, but that white people are way overrepresented in terms of participants in the project. And of course, what that means then is that identification of data to designate streams as impaired and to receive funding for remediation means that that's happening mostly in, because they showed this also for education, whatever, for these more wealthier white areas rather than marginalized communities. And we see similar patterns in a paper we had last year on CUAHSI, which is a program to monitor rain and snow. And we see that precipitation the gauges are just much more likely they're way overrepresented in white neighborhoods. And the consequence being that there's less data available for fine scale forecasting in neighborhoods of color. We also see this in a paper we had last year with the Christmas bird count, in which 96% of our respondents were white. And we're exploring what that means in terms of the data and engagement. So with Crowd the Tap, we were seeing these same kinds of trends. So when we look at what I'm going to call unfacilitated, so just households that come to our project, they find it through whatever sort of unknown, we don't even know how they find our project, but they do, and come and participate. This is comparing households that are entirely white to households that are entirely people of color, and compared to national averages. There's some unknowns and whatnot and prefer not to answer, that's accommodated here. But anyway, what we can see is that white households are very much overrepresented in our sample. And so the approach that we took was to work with facilitator organizations. And so you can see here about 500 or so of our households came through these unknown means. And then through our facilitator organizations, we worked with corporate volunteer program in partnership with SciStarter. We worked with faith communities. We're still growing that program. We work with high school teachers, and we work with universities, including instructors and also undergraduate student ambassadors. And we support our facilitator organizations in different ways. We have lesson plans and stipends and equipment and whatnot for AP environmental science teachers and chemistry teachers. We have kits and programs and webinars and whatnot for supporting our faith communities, and also for our corporate the corporate volunteer program. And then we also have with our universities, our internship programs, and we have that running through an HBCU, a historically Black university, which is Shaw University, and then also North Carolina State University, which is my school, which is a predominantly white institution. Anyway, so the bottom line is that we found that when we compare, like I showed earlier, with our unfacilitated households that come to us, through hearing about us on NPR, or whatever, are overrepresented in terms of being white. But through our facilitated households, we find that we are engaging basically like on par with national averages in terms of race. And we can break this down, by different racial groups to see that, especially with Black households, which were underrepresented in our unfacilitated groups, that through our facilitation partners, they're represented on par. And then same for Asian households. And then our Hispanic households, both facilitated and unfacilitated, are underrepresented, but doing much better, much more closer to being representative through our facilitator organizations. And we also, in both groups, really, our households are much more, we have more multiracial households. But part of that is we're having our data are on the households themselves, whereas what we're comparing to is census data, which is on individuals. So there's that little bit of difference in our comparisons. And then if we were to look at this, just breaking this down by race in our facilitator groups, the bottom line here is basically that for our Black households, our university engagement was really important for increasing representation. And with our Hispanic households, our high school, engaging with high school teachers was really important for increasing representation. And what I want to point out is that, so basically what we're concluding is that with the support of facilitator and partnerships with facilitator organizations, it did increase the racial diversity of engagement in the project. But we want to point out that we didn't measure inclusiveness. We didn't measure like anything about equity or accessibility. And I can imagine with other projects where people might engage with a project and continue, that could be a measure of inclusion. But Crowd the Tap is one and done. It's a household participates once and that's it. So anyway, we have no really idea if we had diversity with inclusion. And in terms of equity, it's in the United States, households of color, other studies have shown that households of color are more likely to have poorer quality drinking water and older infrastructure. And so really, to be equitable, our goal is to have households of color be overrepresented in the data set. And we don't really have that yet. And like I said, we didn't measure anything about accessibility, but I wanted to mention all these aspects because they're really difficult to achieve in large-scale participatory science projects. And I think that's a big challenge our field is facing. And so I just want to conclude with that we have a working group, and it's called IDEAL Participatory Science Working Group, which stands for Inclusive, Diverse, Equitable, Accessible, and Large-Scale Participatory Science. And this use of local partners as facilitators is just one of many sort of tips and guidance that we're providing in this forthcoming IDEAL handbook. We're pilot testing it now with a few groups. Anyway, and I'm just really honored and pleased to have worked with this IDEAL working group, which included many people of color and people of other marginalized identities who have expertise in the participatory sciences, and I think did an amazing job. Anyway, so stay tuned for when we release that handbook. All right, thanks. Oops.
Thanks so much, Karen. So what we will do is we'll have questions after all of our speakers. So I'm going to introduce our second speaker, and so our second speaker is joining us today from the Netherlands. It's Andrea Gammon, who is an assistant professor of ethics and philosophy of technology at TU Delft in the Netherlands, where her research is focusing on engineering ethics education and environmental philosophy. Her talk is titled Contributive Justice and Ethics in Citizen Science. I'll turn it over to you, Andrea.
Great, thank you, Chris. Let me share my screen slides. Okay. So yeah, thank you for this invitation. And I have to, even just at the beginning, apologize. I'm not going to talk about ethical dilemmas, but I am going to talk about ethics and philosophy. So I hope that this will be useful to the participants, and I would really like to hear if these ideas that I'm presenting today are, if you think that they are overly ideal or overly abstract. One of the challenges of doing philosophy in a kind of applied way is trying to map or match sort of more abstracted like ideas around justice with kind of practice-based issues and matters. So I'm very curious to hear if this is so abstract, or if it, I hope that it has some resonance and you have some reactions. So, okay, so my talk is called Contributive Justice and Ethics in Citizen Science. I work at TU Delft, like Chris said. Let's see. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is talk about, first of all, what contributive justice is and its relationship that I see and someone else has observed with citizen science, and then speak about the kinds of ethical considerations that I think already exist for citizen science, but that I think contributive justice puts a little more pressure on. So in the first place, contributive justice is not a very highly theorized dimension of justice. The three more common dimensions of justice that you might be familiar with or you might have heard spoken about, especially within an environmental justice context, would be distributive justice, procedural justice, and recognition justice. Straightforwardly, distributive justice is just, it's interested in an equal or some kind of fair distribution of goods or access to goods. So if you have extreme wealth or income inequality, then you don't have distributive justice. Procedural justice is interested in the procedures, like making sure that people can access or have some kind of representation in the decision-making procedures that affect them in their society. So a good example of a case of a problematic situation with procedural justice would be with climate change and future generations who are not present now. So we're making all of these important decisions around climate policy and mitigation, and they have really no voice in those decisions. So you would worry that they're not being represented procedurally, and that's an issue of justice. And then lastly, of these three is recognition justice, which is probably, again, the less theorized of these three. But this gets to the idea of part of what it is to live in a just society is to be recognized as a person in it, as for who you are. Kyle White defines this as fair representation and considering cultures, values, and situations of all affected parties. And this is, yeah, in some ways, this is like the least, hard, it's maybe the most difficult to kind of put your hands around, but yeah, you can imagine when you know what it feels like not to be recognized or not to have your voice heard. And this is recognition justice insists that those are parts of what matters for justice as well. Okay, but what I'm going to talk about today is this additional notion of contributive justice, which is the opportunity to gain social recognition and esteem by producing value in the society you live in. Contributive justice, as Mark Banks writes, is concerned with ensuring that everyone has an equal opportunity to make some kind of social contribution. While distributive justice emphasizes what we might receive or get from society, contributive justice emphasizes what opportunity we might have to give to society in pursuit of different personal or societal priorities or goals. So it's very pluralist in the sense of you could think of all kinds of different ways of contributing to society. But this tends to be theorized by people who are interested in work, paid work specifically, so in the philosophy of work. And in this field, work is viewed as a social good and as a way of making important and meaningful contributions to the society. It responds to the sort of intuition that I think is commonplace, that it's not just how much wealth or whatever you have access to in your life that makes it good or not. It's also that you want a feeling of fulfillment through contributing something. Now, of course, not all work is meaningful, and that's one of the issues with contributive justice. In fact, meaningful work seems to also be really unfairly distributed in our societies currently. And that's one of the issues that contributive justice would take as a key issue of justice. And so in the theory of work, they're focusing on paid work. But I think that we can see contributive justice as being relevant for things outside of paid work as well. Things like voluntary activities like citizen science. And so what I want to sort of argue in this talk is that citizen science can help contribute towards at least partial contributive justice. Citizen science can contribute towards contributive justice. Okay, I'm not the first person to notice this sort of potentially nice intersection. So Christian Timmerman has written about this overall, or this potential. And he notes, for instance, with citizen science projects, that there are these, they provide in some cases very rich opportunities that would satisfy the kinds of conditions of contributive work, like benefiting from participating in a social group, learning new skills, receiving social recognition for work you've done. And I think most importantly, empowering people actually to participate in knowledge processes. I would make this even I would emphasize that third point especially. I think it's really crucial in the way that Karen also noted at the beginning of her talk, the kind of promise or potential of citizen science as being democratizing, as giving much, hopefully, broader access to all kinds of people, all kinds of groups and different people with different views and experiences who have historically been excluded. So that there's just a greater breadth of motivation and issues that are taken up, especially, I mean, this is probably familiar to all of you, but citizen science projects tend to be motivated by specific needs like testing for lead, the presence of lead in pipes, or other kinds of maybe not advocacy, but other kinds of real world issues. So I think that the possibility of participating in these projects also gives potentially people a way of sort of having more control over setting an agenda for what science does, not just the products, but also the processes like Karen mentioned. So I think that this is like a really nice way. I think in an ideal case, citizen science projects might kind of satisfy this contributive justice demand. But what I also think is that if we want to put these two together, that then there are specific ethical dimensions of citizen science projects that become more relevant as important conditions that are satisfied. So the first one, I'm going to talk about three of these. And the first one, really, I don't think it's data and privacy. And really, I just feel like I have to mention this in a talk that relates ethics with citizen science. I don't actually think that with data and privacy that this changes all that much if contributive justice enters the picture. I think for all citizen science projects, matters of data and privacy are ethically relevant because those decisions really can protect and uphold rights and autonomy of participants, or they can really undermine them. I think contributive justice might give us another reason to make sure these projects are non-exploitative, that they're transparent, that people who are participating in them understand how their data is used, if it's shared, if it's shared with third parties, if it contributes to data sets that other people can access, etc. But I think that when we get to these the 2 and 3, the roles of citizens in citizen science, and then also representation, then there's more that needs to be satisfied if we want citizen science to be contributing to contributive justice. So actually, I kind of should have put this on the first slide. As you know, there are many different there are many sort of levels or modes of participating in citizen science projects. This is a typology from Hackley from 2013, where you have this sort of one level of like crowdsourcing citizens as censors, they say. And then on the 4th level, you have like very collaborative work where people are involved in setting the agenda, deciding what the problem is, as well as these other stages. So I think that if you're thinking about citizen science from the perspective of contributive justice, you're going to want to be sort of moving up that scale so that crowdsourcing is not as meaningful a kind of work as these other sort of higher levels are. So my sense is that if we're bringing these two together, then there's a greater emphasis on the meaningfulness of those projects. Now, I was thinking during Karen's talk, and if I make tangents like this, I'll probably go over time, so I'll keep it brief. But I was also thinking about this specific project, and yeah, it's one and done, like she said, but also like the way that the teams are involved in making sure that the testing is known broadly throughout different communities. Yeah, it seems to me like maybe even in those kinds of projects, maybe the level of participation may be less important if there's some kind of greater motivating need for this testing to happen, for instance. So I would imagine participating in that work, especially in those like outreach teams, would be like incredibly meaningful. So I'm now wondering if it's as straightforward as I'm saying, that the way of participation is sort of key. Maybe also it is shaped by the import or the significance of the project itself. So that's something that Karen's talk made me think about. But so yeah, so Timmerman writing about this is also making the same kind of claim that, look, if we want citizen science to be contributive justice related, then it means that there's going to be like, that we want a really engaged possibility for participants, so that they have the role of formulating questions and interpreting results instead of merely monitoring events or being downgraded to the function of human censors. Now, this is maybe overstating it, but I mean, I think we can see why some different functions would be less meaningful than others. Okay, the last issue is representation. And this
2 minutes.
Thanks. This maps on really nicely with Karen's talk. I think it illustrates exactly why representation is such a huge issue with citizen science. So a lot of this is probably redundant now that we've heard her talk. But again, I think with this issue, if we want contributive justice to be satisfied in some way by citizen science, then we need, representation needs to be broader. We need to make sure that it's not actually contributing to contributive injustice, as Sangara has argued that some forms of volunteer work actually do. This has already been said, but current citizen science projects tend to overrepresent white and middle and upper class populations, and that won't satisfy the need for contributive justice. So we can think about certain ways to make sure that different groups are invited to participate or can access citizen science projects. Walahali makes the point that actually citizen science projects have tended to overlook specific forms of knowledge, and that there's actually great potential for collaboration and inclusion if different modes of co-ownership were involved, for instance, with traditional ecological knowledge type projects. So I think that, this is just to underscore that this condition is really important, especially if we want citizen science projects to be satisfying this need of justice. Okay, so to just wrap up really quickly, I think that there is great potential for these kinds of projects, for citizen science projects, to help achieve contributive justice to some extent by broadening opportunities for people to make meaningful contributions to their communities and to the production of scientific knowledge. But to achieve that, Citizen science projects need to do these specific things. They need, of course, to meet data and privacy requirements, as all projects should. They need to emphasize meaningful work in co-creation and co-ownership models, and importantly, broaden participation, especially with underrepresented and historically excluded groups. Okay, thank you. Oh, I have a bunch of resources. Yeah, I'll just send my slides so that they can be shared. Those are my sources.
That's fantastic. So, and we will, as Julia said, we will put together this resource list from across all of the weeks. So we will get those out of the slides and put them into that resource list. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Great.
All right. So I'm going to move into we have one pop-up speaker today. And so I'll introduce that speaker. Can you unshare, please, Andrea? Because it says I can't share if you are. Thank you. So our 2-minute speaker is Jess Rubin, who is an environmental scientist, ecological restoration practitioner, and educator who works for the University of Vermont in the United States Plant and Soil Science Department as a mycophyto remediation research technician, and I will let her explain that. She directs a few projects on local organic farms, working with mycorrhizal fungi and native plants to mitigate phosphorus pollution, enhance pollinator habitat, facilitate rematriation of the Abenaki people, the indigenous people in the area of Vermont, and to grow eco-literacy. Another hat Jess wears is as creative facilitator of a MycoEvolve, an ecological resilience service that offers earthworks, education, and research in the local community. Jess guides this community science project through MycoLab, which is the community branch of MycoEvolve, facilitating conservation, restoration, remediation, and rematriation of a fragile urban world. So I will turn the table to you, Jess.
Thank you so much, Chris. Grateful to be part of this series. I'll just be presenting today with my MycoEvolve hat on today, speaking about the Pine Street Barge Canal, a fragile urban wild located in Burlington, Vermont on unceded Abenaki territory. This 23-acre parcel was wetlands for thousands of years since the last glaciation, when the settler colonialists, and during that time, the Abenaki hunted and fished for thousands of years. During the 1800s, the settler colonialists dug this canal, cutting off the area from the lake after building these railroad tracks, and filled in the wetlands with wood chips and sawdust. After the lumber industry waned in the 1890s, when the petrochemical industry rose, a coal gasification plant was built on one of these parcels, we'll call number 501, and that operated till 1966. When it closed, the site was deemed on the EPA National Priority List as a Superfund site with 56 toxins of concern, namely heavy metals and hydrocarbons in the soil and water. Since then, the land has naturally been attenuating through microbes, fungi, and plants. Last summer, spring and fall, the community branch of MycoEvolve conducted a community science inventory through 8 gatherings. These are some of the 233 species we were able to identify through an iNaturalist project. We created 155 of them are research grade. It's worth noting that we did a rapid assessment evaluation for water quality and only found pollution tolerant species within the categories of bivalves, gastropods, copepods, and dragonfly nymphs. Though a notable species we found, Hydrometra martini, known as the water measure, was the first found in the state. Currently, St. Michael College environmental science students are gathering GIS points for the 501 site, and we are going to conduct another community science inventory, creating a new project this summer on that plot. So we have the Barge Canal Superfund site that this data is from, on the back 11 acres owned by the city. 501, the developer of the adjacent brownfield site, is donating to the city, so we'll have data on that. And our long-term goals are to present our findings to the Vermont Conservation Commission and Burlington Grow Wild for the long-term conservation, restoration, remediation, and rematuration of this fragile urban wild. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jess, for being here and for sharing that project. So I invite our speakers all to turn on their cameras at this point and invite our audience to share questions that you have in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I'm going to ask a question directed to Karen. So you talked, I think it's really interesting that you talked about the groups, the liaison groups that you worked with, and we've been doing some similar work. And I thought it was that you have universities and SciStarter. For people who don't know SciStarter, that's an organization that has a directory of programs and helps people find different citizen science programs, faith communities, and business corporate like volunteer programs. And I wondered about if you had explored nonprofits. One of the groups that we work with is a new American community leaders who are each know their own communities. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. You have the universities and the corporate partners who have, do you think it has to do with the relationship that they have with a specific smaller target audience within each of those liaison groups, or have you explored looking to work with nonprofits that are specifically around a certain cultural community?
Yeah, we've been trying a lot more than what was listed there too. And we have this weekend, actually, we have an event in the community of Rocky Mount that's in partnership with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network as a facilitator of with a lot of different local partners in Rocky Mount too. So, I mean, I guess, but what you're getting at, I do think the best kind of facilitators are ones that help with localizing a project. So I mean, it's a large scale project, but having there's a lot of organizations, and some are NGOs, that have that structure of local ambassadors, our student ambassadors. They do a service learning spring break, so they go home to their community, they go back home to their hometowns, and it's within their social networks and their local organizations that they offer testing. So yeah, and with Verizon, I mean, there's employees all over the country that opt to participate and engage through that corporate volunteer program. So it really varies, but I don't know. So I hope that's kind of answering.
Yeah, no, you're getting at where I'm thinking, because it's sort of on the individual level where their knowledge is and their community is, and they take that and make that connection as the liaison for your project.
Yeah, and the other way I think of it is taking our citizen science projects and turning them into tools. So they're not just a project that someone can engage in, but they're a tool that any community could use for their own. It's flexible enough. Oh, if a community needs to do an inventory of their pipes and their water quality, so they can apply for Justice 40 funding, or or whatever it might be, then okay, well, here's a tool for gathering that information together.
Thank you. So we have some questions in the chat at this point. The first one is for Karen. In one of your slides, you mentioned that peace of mind about drinking water as the final goal. Can you elaborate a bit more on that? What framework is that set based on? Thanks in advance.
So yeah, I mean, the real end goal is that everyone is safe from lead in water. We use the screening. I mean, basically what that slide was saying is that we can't afford to test everyone's home in particular. So we screen it with that information to say someone is should be concerned or doesn't need to be concerned. I mean, and basically if there's really no indication that more testing is needed, we hope it provides some, I guess we wrote that, some peace of mind. If when we have funds available, we do still provide more testing if someone is screens as low, but really is still concerned, we'll be like, okay, well, we can test, or we can help arrange with your utility to have testing done. Yeah, so if you're asking about like that screening model, that came from our preliminary data and a Bayesian belief network model that our engineering modeler part of the team did. And she did that first based on, there was a big data set with well water, and then she's rerunning it with our early crowd the tap data for municipal water. And the things that came up as important were like age of, some that you'd expect, like the types of pipes, the age of the home. And then in terms of water chemistry, it's really like the presence of copper and iron that might just indicate a little bit that it's not plastic pipes, basically, and that there's some risk. So anyway, so it was a Bayesian belief network model that informed that kind of heuristic model that we use for our screening. And we're still refining it as more data come in.
Thank you. We have one other question here for Karen. I'm wondering if you've ever done any work or know of community water quality testing programs in prisons, given that prisons often have aging infrastructure and might be likely candidates for lead contamination. Yeah, that's.
You know, I'm going to look in the literature. I haven't, I don't know of any programs, and I haven't. Yeah, thanks for raising that issue, because I actually hadn't thought about that. Yeah, and it's definitely a vulnerable population.
Yeah, indeed.
I'm going to look into that because I don't know the answer.
Thank you. So I think I have a question I will pose to Andrea, but open to any of the three of you. So thinking about this broadening and representation and having people who can participate, how do they come to participate in contributive justice? Do you have advice for programs that already exist, or as somebody is planning a program to avoid being, and I'm going to say colonialist, and saying, particularly if the program already exists, hey, we've got this program, we want to diversify our participation, but isn't just having that thought potentially colonialist because it's being driven by the program and not by the people who may be in need?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, like, I mean, when I was thinking about this talk and citizen sciences in this more abstract way, those are certainly, and like, yeah, you want this kind of like model of co-creation and that responds to actual need and interest of people, grassroots, etc. But then listening to Karen's talk, where like there's a demonstrable harm, like where like in a way, it's like, it doesn't matter who raises this as a topic or as a project, that like, this seems like this screening needs to happen. And yeah, I don't know. And maybe there are cases that are just like, that are like that. And then the question is, okay, well, maybe you're not involving people in the sort of question, like the forming of the scientific question or like the procedures for this. But then I think there are still, and I think Karen's project was just, it sounded so successful in this way that it like actually is responsive to the demographics of this area. I don't know how big the area is. And yeah, okay, how do you make sure that people who aren't, I don't know, like otherwise, like who don't have the time or the like capacity to pay attention to like, you know, fun science projects or bird counts or whatever, actually understand and get the information that they need and the support they need. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's going to, in all cases, it's probably going to be a mix of different things where you have some projects or like that do sort of emanate from this sort of recognized need of risk, of harms that will happen to these communities. And then in other cases, yeah, you hope that there are projects that are just inspired based on people's, like the needs that they observe in their communities, which can be, you know, related or completely unrelated to risks like lead in drinking water.
Karen, how did your project get started? Was it driven from like Flint, Michigan, for instance, or?
I mean, in a sense, because EPA, because after Flint, EPA set up like a national, like a call for, it was like a national priorities, they considered it. But I was just going to say that like there are already like literally thousands of citizen science projects that are started by scientists like me, institutions that are top down, like driven, that already exist. And so I do think it's like imperative that there is a way of like retrofitting them, like of like changing them, like they have to change in ways, and that's that point of that ideal program, because we definitely don't want to continue with like this mindset of like, oh, no, the participants need to change. We need to provide participants need to change in these particular ways so they fit our projects. No, the projects need to change. And so much of it relates to the fact that these projects are started by these big science institutions. And we know science has the same, I mean, it mirrors the same problem, like has this diversity problem. And so it does speak to like those priorities. And like a lot of these thousands of projects that exist from these big institutions are aligned with these like dominant culture research priorities. And like, that's not really working, right? That isn't serving everybody. So yeah, so it's very like fundamental level things to address. But I do think participatory science is more likely to lead the way in that than just like regular science. And then we can bring regular science along because we'll do a better job.
Love that. I love that thought. We have another question for you, Karen, in the chat or in the Q&A. Have you
Jess had Jess's hand.
Oh, did we already get that? No, I think we didn't yet.
Jess has her hand up.
Oh, sorry, Jess.
Didn't her input.
Just on that note, real quick, I didn't get time to talk about the eco-literacy part of our community science, but we have run into that exact issue because of systemic white supremacy in terms of who has access to ecological knowledge and skills. In terms of inviting more diverse populations, it's almost like a whole separate campaign. We're creating multiple mediums, going into the neighborhoods, creating little pilot feeders in, and then it balances, how much of your time is through education versus actually robust data gathering. And we're going for the education at this point because it's community science, but that's just a whole nother like project as a, and to really do it well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's, well put, in that, to Karen's point too, that there's so many projects out there, and you need to, each way to diversify is going to be its own unique plan and process and whatever the program becomes, right? So I do think there's another question for Karen here. It says, have you also explored different age groups participating in the project? Like how, for example, older generations can participate, and what are their possible obstacles in participating?
Yeah, we've seen that. I mean, so we've had like we've been struggling and trying to still crack the nut of like engaging our faith communities. But when we have been successful, it definitely involves, because it's an older community, and there's and same with our environmental justice communities too. Like we're preparing more with paper data forms instead of online, because there is a bit of a digital divide. More emphasis too on privacy, like more information about data handling and privacy protections and that kind of thing, and more work with like individual ambassadors who can like really go in home and help when needed. Because we've already made like video tutorials, and like here's how you go into your cellar and find your water heater and crawl around and like find pipes, and yeah, there's like definitely some limitations there. So yeah, so a little bit.
Thank you. Other questions from any of the speakers to one another, or from the audience members, the participants? Well, I'll pose another question around language, and thinking about the videos that you just mentioned, Karen, or in our audience across the globe here. How have you done different over voiceovers in different languages to help different populations to understand the process, or are you relying upon showing as opposed to talking?
Is that specific? So we haven't, so our project is not multilingual, which is probably also explains part of our struggles with having full representation of Hispanic audiences in the US.
Jess, in the programs that you have, you're working with different cultural communities or the Abenaki or both?
So currently we're mostly a volunteer group with myself as a scientist and maybe one or two other scientists, but mostly community members. And currently we've just been like teaching basics of like how to use a hand lens, how to use field guides. And it's mostly been a white audience of community members and students. There are Abenaki that we are working with, not in gathering inventory, but in gathering their stories of pre-colonial history of that site and centering their voices in our programs and centering their voices in the long-term vision and our strategy. We have talked this season based on some of the other webinars you've hosted in this series about going back to the beginning of the research questions and having the community what we've been running into is a lot of the community don't even know or care about the site. Their population we're trying to reach are trying to like survive and pay bills and deal with like other more pressing issues. So we're trying to figure out that right now. It's a current live thread. And obviously we're going to have signs when we get there in Abenaki for sure, when we start restoring with native plants, but we haven't gotten beyond that population in terms of representation. We're hoping to. Thanks.
Thank you. So there's another question here in the chat. Karen, can you elaborate on differences among renters and homeowners, as renters likely to be lower income may have challenges to access a building's plumbing system?
Yeah, and that is one of the questions that we ask, like in the screening, is if people if they rent or own. I'm trying to think if we have found differences in risk. I don't think we have necessarily seen differences in risk between renters and owners. Some of the other things we've been exploring are some of the issues related to trust in science. And so, because we haven't, so people who use the screening, the way we have had it set up is they can decide how much they want to share their data. Like if they just want to share it for the research team, they want to share it with utilities, if they want to share it with other researchers, like, and it's all shared in an anonymized way, but in terms of like site specific, like house specific details, how it gets shared, people can control that. And people can also, when they fill out a lot of the forms or a lot of the questions, there's always I prefer not to say, like what's your race? I prefer not to say, what's your age, whatever. And so we were looking sort of at that in terms of some of those data, in terms of like how much people trust what's like the system and how much they're just choosing to like prefer not, like do the minimum. And I think we did see some differences there, and I'm trying to remember now, between renters and owners, and also by race, between people who maybe have more privilege and don't feel those risks compared to those that are like in different marginalized groups, including renters, that do feel those risks. So I think they were a little more private, if I recall, but I'd have to look back, and that's a second paper in prep. I'd have to check with Danny. I don't think she's on here right now.
So the other thing that comes to mind to me around this is the time that people have. So, and I see maybe that's where you're going to go there. Andrea, I'll let you talk because we don't have much time.
It's really not an urgent question, but it's probably not what you were going to say, but I was going to ask Jess, I'm just curious. I'm curious more about the restoration project and sort of where the, in environmental philosophy, there's like a lot of work on environmental restoration and sort of like, what are we trying to do when we restore sites? And one of the main questions is like, well, what do you restore it to? Like, what's the time period that you're looking at? And how do you make that choice? Because if you sort of recognize like, well, there's no way of going back to sort of some untouched nature, then you are making a choice about what, So could you say a little more about like, yeah, the process for those kinds of decisions in this project, if they were also kind of like, I don't know what you say, like crowd decided, or were they sort of top down?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very hot topic in ecological restoration circles currently. My work on farms is a little bit of a different category, particularly at Shelburne Farms, our restoration project there. We went back to like pollen core studies and Aboniki knowledge of what plants were there, and kind of are using that as our plant palette, as our like kind of baseline, knowing about, you know, migration of plants with climate change. So taking that into consideration, and also, you know, focusing on phosphorus hyperaccumulating plants and pollinator specific. In this urban wild, it's a bit of a different situation because of it was wetlands, and now it's, you know, it's actually a different anthropogenic ecosystem. Our process, once we get there, is going to be guiding a ecological restoration class to practice their skills in coming up with a plant palette, and having them host a community forum, and providing people who attend the community forum with some baseline knowledge and links to do research ahead of time, and just kind of have them have the experience of receiving that feedback and integrating into their design. That's further down the line. So
yeah, thank you so much, Jess. I'm conscientious that we're at 1 minute over here. So just want to thank again, all three of you, Karen and Andrea and Jess, for being our speakers, for our audience, for great conversation. Really appreciate that, learned a lot, and we will share resources in our live document over on the CUAHSI website. Thank you all.